Okay, so we learned about physical and chemical changes, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about chemical reactions and chemical changes. So first, look at this picture. Is baking cookies, do you think this is a chemical reaction? So in this picture here, you have all the ingredients for baking cookies. And then this arrow is representing the process of baking. And then at the end, you have your cookies. So do you have something new? So remember that a chemical change is when a new substance is created. So chemical changes create new substances, and a physical change, they don't. So what do you think about this one? All right, and so now let's look at Alka-Seltzer and water. Is this a chemical reaction? So what do you notice before the arrow and after the arrow in that yellow box? So before the arrow, you have citric acid, which is Alka-Seltzer, plus the baking soda, and then you have your arrow, and then afterwards, you have water, carbon dioxide, and sodium citrate. So what are you noticing? Do you think this is a chemical reaction or a physical change, and how can you tell? This question here, what are the reactants and what are the products? That's what we're going to learn about today. That's what our focus is figuring out what are the reactants and what are the products. So based on what you think, do you think that what comes before the arrow are the reactants or are they the products? Do you think that what comes after the arrow are the reactants or the products? So we already know what a chemical reaction is because that's what we've talked about. So this right here reminds you that it's the process where there's a chemical change which results in a new substance being formed that's different from the original substance. So this includes the reactants. So here's your definition of reactants. These are the substances before the reaction. So if on the last slide you said that the reactants were what comes before the arrow, you would be correct. So these, what comes before the arrow, these are the reactants. And then what comes after the arrow, those are called the products. So these are chemicals created as a result of the reaction. So anything that comes after the arrow, we call those the products. So in a chemical reaction, you're always going to have, again, the reactants, which is like your ingredients, what you started with. And then the arrow represents the reaction going. And then afterward, whatever comes out of it, that is the product. So like in math, when you do multiplication, your answer is called your product. In a chemical reaction, what comes out of the reaction is your product. So let's look at Alka-Seltzer and water again now. So what are reactants? And then what are the products? You should know them now. So if you said that your reactants are these, then you are correct. These are the reactants because these are what are going into the reaction. This is what it's starting with. Citric acid, which again is Alka-Seltzer, and water. And then what's coming out, these are the products. So remember, what comes after the arrow is always the products. It's what you end up with. So before, you had something completely different than what came out afterward. All right, how about baking soda and vinegar? What are your reactants and what are your products? So hopefully, again, you said that these over here, these are your reactants. And then this over here, this is your product. So reactants, products. So remember, what goes into the reaction of the reactants, what comes out of the reaction of the products. And if you look carefully, you'll see that like you have the same number of molecules. That doesn't change. They just rearrange. So you started with a certain amount of molecules in your reactants. That same number is actually also in your products. It's just that they've been rearranged and formed new substances.